This is Dateline News and Conversation. Today is 9/11, September 11th, 2025. 24 years ago, do you remember where you were? Do you remember what you were doing? Do you remember who you were with when television across the country and the world televised the attack on the Twin Towers in New York, come to be known as Ground Zero? Do you remember what you thought? Do you remember the feelings you had? I do. I think most anybody that was alive at that time probably does. My guest tonight, a good friend, a really profound and deep thinker, philosopher, sociologist, and author, Ed Curtin. Ed, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Regis. I'm very happy to be here on this very important day. Uh, that's I'm glad to be here and to talk about this with you because we need to present what these ideas to the world.
Well, you penned an article yesterday on the 10th. It was entitled Language, Mind Control, and 9/11. When I saw the title of that, I went, oh my God, because lately I've been very consumed with this topic of language and mind control. It's been around since the time of Sigmund Freud and his nephew, Edward Bernays. A lot of people will be familiar with that. Maybe others will not. This might be the first time they hear anybody talk about language and how it's used to uh, propagandize, to control our minds, to create manufactured consent. Now, you have a personal story to tell about what happened on September 1st, on September 11th, 2001. Tell me about your family's history in New York City and how you were so emotionally struck by what happened on that day.
Sure. Well, I at the time I was a college professor, and on that Tuesday, beautiful, beautiful morning, as it is here in Massachusetts today, I was uh, I was home, and my daughter and her soon-to-be husband, who lived in New York City, had been here at our home for the weekend, and they had left the day before to go to Cape Cod for a week's vacation. Uh, and the next morning, or Tuesday morning, I should say, at around 9 o'clock, the phone rang, and it was my daughter calling from Cape Cod. And she said to me, Papa, did you hear the news? I said, no, what? She said, turn on the TV. The World Trade Tower has been hit with a plane. And so I turned on the TV, and what I saw was a plane hitting the tower. And I said, they just did a replay of it. And she said, oh, no, no, that's not a replay. That's another plane. And it hit the South Tower. And we watched in horror as, the scene unfolded. And it turned out that her soon-to-be husband worked at the 100th floor of the South Tower. And he was an actor, but he had this job, a temporary job that he worked at for a year, and he had never taken a vacation. And the company that he worked for in the offices that he was in on the 100th floor, 100 and I forget, 75, 77 people died that morning. And he would have been there, but by fate, he he was not there. the one day, of the year. And another guy who was there was one of my father's very good friends who uh, had retired recently, and he had worked for the city of New York, and he had a consultancy job in the North Tower, one day a month, and he that was his day, and it was his day to die. And I guess the reason why it affected me so, I was born in the Bronx, went to high school and graduate school in Manhattan. My family's history is very deeply involved in New York City. My grandfather was the um, deputy chief of the New York City Fire Department. I actually had his badge on uh, on my desk right now. Many, many members of my grandfather's, the three brothers worked for the fire department. His sister was a policewoman, another sister was a teacher. I have multiple nieces and nephews, cops, detectives, and so forth. In fact, one of uh, my niece's husband, Dave, was a New York City terrorism detective. And he was the one person allowed up above the towers that morning in a helicopter where he took hundreds of very, very famous pictures of what happened from the sky. He took the pictures, from the helicopter. And so it was very, very emotional because of all these connections. My family roots go back 175 years to New York City. Uh, we're New Yorkers. And, even though I didn't live in New York anymore, I lived and still do in Massachusetts. It doesn't leave you, your where you grew up, the roots. You still, and my family's still down there.
Well, uh, all of us had a very deep personal and emotional reaction to that. But the reaction you had, given your family history in New York City, uh, it was a very emotional reaction at first. And I
Yes,
want you to describe how uh, this became the motivation for your quest to begin investigating what really happened. Pick up the
yes.
story. Pick up the story from there, Ed.
Yeah, actually, the next day I spoke to, well, I call him my nephew, the Dave, who is the anti-terrorism detective above in the helicopter. I spoke to him the next day and said, Dave, were you wearing a mask? And he said, no, but don't tell Ginny, that's my nephew, and she'd kill me if she knew I didn't have a mask. Because of the fumes and the smoke and all of that were going up. But I immediately said to another friend, I hear the government's explanation, Osama bin Laden and blah, blah, blah. And I immediately thought, this is a crock. This is not, it makes no sense. And one of the reasons I thought that immediately was my specialty as a professor is the sociology of knowledge and propaganda and political sociology. And none of this rang true. I would teach courses on Edward Bernays and all of these early propagandists, and of course, know Orwell's work. And so I started immediately to investigate uh, really what happened because the government's, it just did not ring true to me.
In my own case, uh, I didn't begin questioning right away. Uh, in fact, I actually believed initially that it was terrorists uh, because they didn't like our freedoms, that George Bush BS. And it wasn't until a little bit later that I hosted a meeting of Richard Gage, an engineer who founded an organization called Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. He had come to Portland, Maine with a video, and he presented all of the engineering technologies and information about how that was impossible. And
Right.
he pointed out that it was really controlled demolition. He had a friend, well, not a friend, but a colleague there who was an expert in controlled demolition. And he gave all of the reasons why, using video, why these towers were not brought down by two airplanes. But that took me, that maybe that was a year or two later before I really understood that the government narrative was a lie. I didn't suspect that from the beginning. Um, so you mentioned that you realized very quickly that the official narrative was just not believable. As I look back on it now, it's impossible to believe it. Just like the lies from the government about Kennedy's assassination, I immediately connected the two and I said, oh my God, uh, what's behind this is really evil. So pick it up from there. You had mentioned in the article you no longer refer to the events of that day as 9/11. What did you mean by that?
Well, what I meant by it was, and again, this was a process of research that I started doing. I read an op-ed piece in the New York Times um, by a guy named Bill Keller. And the title, this is the next day, this is September 12th. The title was America's Emerging, um, emerge, America's Emergency Line, 9/11. And I knew who this guy, Bill Keller, was, who in a year became a huge backer of the Iraq War, which they linked to 9/11 erroneously and falsely through so many different lies. And Bill Keller became the uh, uh, the editor of the New York Times for many years. He was the chief editor. And in this article, he keeps using this term 9/11 emergency, and now we know how the Israelis feel and blah, 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 without quoting the whole article. And I said to myself, wait a second, 9/11, that's the phone number that you call. Someone's having a heart attack or you need police or an ambulance. A terrible event has happened. And so I realized right away that Keller was linking the attacks of that day to this psychological connection to the phone number, emergency. And it was on September 14th that George Bush declared a national emergency. And that national emergency has been renewed every year since, 24 years later. And the U.S. is still under a national emergency. And that national emergency was used to wage all of these wars across the globe for all these years. And that's where it started. And I realized this is a propaganda meme. 9/11, 9/11, 9/11, 9/11, emergency, 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 emergency. And that's why I don't use the term anymore. I realized right away that that was propaganda. And that's why he wrote the article.
Well, you went on to state in your article, which I'm going to post the link to that in the description because I people really need to read that. But you wrote that after meticulous study and research, uh, the government reports were blatantly false, and you concluded that the attacks were an intelligence operation led by the likes of neoconservatives such as Dick Cheney, Rumsfeld, and Wolfowitz. Uh, you know, I came to that conclusion not after meticulous research, but just after 2 or 3 years of more information coming out. For me, I was convinced that Dick Cheney, uh, and I'll never forget it, uh, he came on television. There were video of him in this emergency control room underground somewhere, and there was video of him there really running the country. And there was video of George Bush uh, reading some silly little story to children in a school when he was informed by an assistant that something terrible happened. We learned later that he took off and he was flying on Air Force One because they were afraid there was going to be an attack on Washington. And if, in fact, there was they claim a plane that flew into the Pentagon, and it turns out that no way it could have been a plane. But anyway, tell me about uh, you concluded that this was an intelligence operation. How did you come to that conclusion? And then I want you to talk about how this was incredibly well planned, not
Sure.
on the day of September 11th, but probably quite a bit of time prior to that. Pick it up from there, Ed.
Well, first of all, I knew who Osama bin Laden was. And Osama bin Laden was he had been recruited by the CIA long before September 1st, 2001. And uh, he was not the person they said he was. However, so that's kind of in the background. But I knew I had listened to Bush give a speech on May 1st of that year, and I'm getting a little ahead of it here. But he said the U.S. was going to have to withdraw from the ABM treaty. Uh, we're going to have to, let me quote his exact words, we must be willing to rethink the unthinkable. Uh, I had read all of the reports and heard all of the newscasters say this is a new Pearl Harbor, this is a new Pearl Harbor, this is a new Pearl Harbor. And uh, uh, even the New York Times, I believe, had a front page article in the days after saying, or maybe it was the same day, or September 12th, that George Bush wrote in his diary a new Pearl Harbor. But I knew there was a group called the Project for the New American Century, PNAC for short, that had a report called Rebuilding America's Defenses. And I had read that, and that was the year before, exactly approximately a year before. And in that article that they put out, and they were very influential. These are all the same neocons that you mentioned earlier, including Richard Pearl and others. And they said that the United States was going to need a new Pearl Harbor in order to rework their defensive strategy and attack multiple countries throughout the Middle East. And you can go through the list from Syria to Iraq to Iran, etc. All these countries, Libya, uh, but we need a new Pearl Harbor to get the population behind us. And this was repeated over and over again. And then during that summer, I had known this. I had seen it before. There was a movie that was, I read an article saying a new movie was coming out in December called Pearl Harbor. And of course, December 7th, 1941 was the, date of Pearl Harbor attacks. Uh, but it turns out the movie came out on Memorial Day weekend, May 25th, 2001. And it was in the press all summer, all summer. It's a lousy movie, but the name Pearl Harbor was there constantly throughout the summer. And I said, wow, that's really weird. It seems like we were being primed throughout this whole period of time for this term, Pearl Harbor, and all of the associations. And I won't get into, the actual attack on Pearl Harbor, but just the term, it would evoke in most Americans and most people's minds a sneak attack. Uh, and so I knew all of this stuff, and I knew, and this is perhaps not connected, but I also knew that there was a Democratic congressman who his name was Gary Condit. Your listeners probably don't remember who he was. He sat on the House um, Intelligence Committee. He was quite important, uh, and in the his name was in the news all summer too because he was accused of killing a young Israeli intern and dumping her body in a Washington, D.C. park. And he didn't kill this girl, but it seemed like a very strange story to be circulating all summer. Also, all that summer it was Pearl Harbor, Gary Condit, Pearl Harbor, Gary Condit. And it was Judith Miller on the front page of the New York Times, who has since been disgraced, writing about anthrax and anthrax attacks, and they're coming, and blah blah blah. Uh, and and believe it or not, in uh, June of that same year, there was a simulation done called Dark Winter. The government did this now. Dark Winter, which was Judith Miller played a person in it. New York Times people were in it. Uh, and they envisioned exactly what happened on September 11th and the days that followed, especially with the anthrax attacks, which is, I could talk about that. That's very, very important. Most people forget that they happened if, but they're linked, clearly linked.
Well, explain how they're linked, Ed.
Well, sure, they're linked. There's a very, very important book written by a Canadian researcher named Graham McQueen. It's called The 2001 Anthrax Deception. And in that book, McQueen tells the whole story of these anthrax attacks. Uh, and basically, if listeners recall, there were after September 11th, there were letters sent to various members of the media, Tom Brokaw of NBC, two U.S. congressmen, oh gosh, what are their names? Leahy from Vermont and the other guy's name, very prominent Democratic congressman. Uh, and these anthrax spores that were in these letters killed a few people, but sent, panic throughout the country. Uh, but it turns out, and one of the terms that was used in those weeks of October by all the media uh, was the this term, the unthinkable, the unthinkable. The unthinkable has happened. The world has changed forever. The unthinkable, the unthinkable. It was all over the media. Uh, However, in the media didn't know when they started doing this that the first anthrax letter that was mailed had the word the unthinkable in it, or at least the media said they didn't know. And it was spelled weirdly. It was spelled, I'm looking at my note here. Where the heck is it? It was spelled Unthinkabel, the unthinkable. But that letter was mailed before the media started talking about but of course, that goes back to George Bush on May 1st, the unthinkable. And it goes back to the Project for the New American Century. They were all using this term, the unthinkable. And then the whole story was the unthinkable has happened, the world has changed, and all of that was used subsequently or immediately to promote the attack on, quote, Al Qaeda and Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan. And by the way, I had a student at the time who was in the Marines, and he was based in California. And he and his group, long before they were shipped out to Afghanistan, this was all prepared in advance to so-called fight Al Qaeda and get Osama bin Laden, who's in a cave in Afghanistan, when in fact he was in Islamabad, Pakistan. He was in a hospital on September 10th in 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 Pakistan, and he was probably in the same hospital the next day. But they said he was the mastermind behind these attacks. It's just utterly ridiculous stuff. Uh, and then subsequently, we found out that the anthrax spores came from a U.S. government weapons lab, uh, not from overseas, not from the two guys that were blamed for it. The first guy uh, got a huge settlement from the U.S. government, millions of dollars. The second guy, supposedly committed suicide uh, because but it came from the U.S. lab, the weapons lab. So how the hell did that connect to Osama bin Laden and his 19 band of merry men there, it makes no sense.
Well,
Uh,
the effect of all of this, as you alluded to, was to justify wars of aggression, uh,
right.
namely the war on terror. And 24 years later, we are still fighting that euphemism, the war on terror. Now, I want to underline what I think is so important here. You said the sophistication of these attacks um, suggests that a great deal of planning had been involved and a cover up was underway. Uh, Ed, I'm sitting here now having this conversation with you, and I'm thinking, wow, how far back did this planning begin? Um, you've revealed, obviously, the project for the new American century. Uh, these neocons who back then said we need a new Pearl Harbor. Why?
Right.
Well, to terrify and to control the minds of the American people to follow the lead and the message that the government was going to put out. And as you've been mentioning, it's been put out repeatedly by the media, repeatedly over and over and over again. So I want to move on now to the next part of your article, which has to do with mind control. You wrote, for so many people, their minds seem to have been made up from the start. Is this not the strategy behind mind control, behind manufactured consent, that you plant these concepts or these ideas ahead of time to precondition people to accept the narrative when something happens. Is that what you're talking about?
That's exactly what I'm talking about. It takes a long time. You have to plant the seeds that will be used when the event happens to get people to consent to it. And so it's, I don't blame normal people, ordinary people, for being taken in by it at first. Uh, but then, then Bush almost immediately, he and Rumsfeld and Cheney and these people, despite the absurdities of the actual attacks themselves, which we can talk about, uh, immediately started to link Saddam Hussein to nuclear weapons. He gave a speech. He gave a speech in the fall, Saddam Hussein and, nuclear weapons, and we're going to have to get him and blah, blah, blah. They all did this. And then by the next year, the drumbeat, we had gone into Afghanistan, of course, didn't get, quote, Osama bin Laden, because he was on the lam, so to speak, for such a long time. That was quite convenient. The whole thing is quite convenient. Uh, and I'm losing my train of thought here.
Well,
What am I?
let's pick it up really from there. Uh,
Yeah,
Bush Bush right
hang
away
on.
was acting on this war on terror, and it was Osama bin Laden we had to get, and then it was, oh my God, uh, Iraq, Saddam Hussein, who had these weapons, and he wanted to destroy us. There it is again, the unthinkable. We've got to do
That's
away
right.
with this terrorist, and there's well, that whole war on terror ever since has been based on the lie that these other countries want to do us harm because, as that idiot said, they they hate us because of our freedoms. Now,
Yeah, yeah.
you concluded, and this is what I want to start looking into now a little bit in depth.
Well, Regis, could I, before you get to that, just let me finish the thought that I lost. If, I don't know where it went, but it just came back while you were talking. Um, uh, in the January of 2003, as the drumbeat for war in against Iraq and this crazy linkage with Hussam Hussein, which of course Bush's father had waged in the early 90s against Iraq. It was father and son, we're following it up here. We'll get the bad guy. But it was all bullshit, to put it very simple. And I remember in January, a lot of people were buying this stuff, and there were dissidents who weren't. I wrote a newspaper article in January of 2001, and I said it's a lie. They're lying. They're lying. And then what's his name? Colin Powell goes in front of the UN, holds up a little tube of so-called anthrax, I believe it was supposed to be. He was lying through his teeth. He knew he was lying, and to the present day, people still defend him. This great general, who was, of course, the general in the first Gulf War, as they called it, the made-for-TV war under George Herbert Walker Bush in the early 90s. And this whole damn thing was planned. And then we invaded Iraq, and that war, has killed so many people, but it was part of the project for the new American century's plan right from the start. Iraq, Iran, Syria, all those countries in the Middle East. And here
Yeah,
we are.
one of the things that's really angered me to no extent is the United States and the coalition of the willing destroyed Iraq, which is the cradle of civilization, the Tigris and the Euphrates. And what they did is they stole, thousands of artifacts going back thousands of years
Yeah.
from museums in Iraq. And so they've destroyed that history and they didn't care. Well, anyway, I got off the subject a little bit, but um, I wanted to get into that you concluded that linguistic mind control was in place before, during, and after the attacks. And you said, as with all good propaganda, the language had to be insinuated over time and introduced through intermediaries. And the intermediaries were basically the mainstream media, just as they are today. Let's pick it up from there, Ed.
Well, sure. The mainstream media are really an adjunct of the U.S. government. They speak for them. They speak for the darker forces within the government. You know, when I like to try to be careful. There are great, wonderful human beings who work for the U.S. government, thousands and thousands of them in all capacities. But these darker forces that run U.S. foreign policy, that basically own the country, um, uh, they're the ones that are behind all of this, and they they plan these things far, far in advance. I recently wrote an article about to bring it up to the present day, Donald Trump and blah, blah, blah. Well, that's part of the same game that's being played today. You mentioned Iraq being the cradle of civilization. I think it's almost certain that this fall, the United States and Israel will again attack Iran, which is this ancient, civilization, Persian civilization. And it's all there in the mind control operation that goes on and on and on and on to the present day. I quote somewhere in the article a friend of mine who's since deceased, Vince Salandria, who is a Philadelphia lawyer. He was perhaps the earliest critic of the Warren Commission. And he was talking about the Kennedy assassination. It was a state operation, and they say it's a mystery. It's no mystery. It was very, very obvious from the start. Very, very obvious that Kennedy was not killed by a lone assassin. But that's the story that was put out. And anyone who has, a bit of a brain can see this. Maybe a lot of people can see it now, but that was a CIA operation, and the CIA hires very smart people. And they don't just hire like people with knives and guns and who can kill people. They hire PhDs in English and in linguistics and in propaganda and in media and so forth. And then they place them throughout the media. The mass media that you referred to is filled with intelligence agents on the TV every day in all of these newspapers. It's they're everywhere. And so the mass media basically is they do the work of the dark forces, and they manufacture consent.
Yeah, and uh, not lingering too long on mainstream media, but there have been several composite videos that have been out there on the internet that show the different networks, evening news, and also on social media. They are all repeating the exact same words, Ed. Exactly.
Yes.
Uh,
Yeah.
and they're scripted. And it's like it becomes so obvious when you see that. Not everybody watches simultaneously uh, ABC, NBC, CBS, plus CNN, plus Fox News, plus so many others. But when they put those composites together, you you have to know that the script is coming from somewhere else, and you just
Yes.
described it. Now, what I want to do, Ed, is I want to get into the topic of how they've used language. And you said in summary form, uh, you outlined uh, the language, specific terms that they use to control the minds of the American people about the September 11th attacks and the subsequent anthrax attacks. Let's go through them one by one, beginning with what you
Sure.
already alluded to, Pearl Harbor.
Yeah. Well, Pearl Harbor is probably the one that jumps out to people. And it was used right from the start. It was pre-planned, as we've discussed before. Uh, and it was Pearl Harbor, a new Pearl Harbor, a new Pearl Harbor, Pearl Harbor, Pearl Harbor, throughout all of the media. And it was, set out there by the Project for the New American Century the year before. That would be the first one. The second one
Oh, well, wait a
would
minute.
be
Wait a minute. I want to continue on about this new Pearl Harbor. Uh, when you look back on it, the new Pearl Harbor was 9/11. This
right.
made up, this fictional lie. It's not a myth, it's a lie that two planes crashed into the Twin Towers and brought them down uh, in no time, a matter of seconds. Um, and so I really think it's important for people to understand and remember that the Twin Towers were the new Pearl Harbor, and that had been planned maybe several years before that. Uh, I just wanted to underscore that because, when you look back on it now, you can obviously see the importance of that term, a new Pearl Harbor, and what the Twin Towers really symbolized in the minds of people. It began to control uh, how they saw those events. Pick it up now on your second term. You talked about the term
Sure.
homeland.
Yeah, the second term is really weird and bizarre. If you know, I've been around decades, so I go back born in the 1940s and grew up in this country. And the second term is this term homeland, homeland, which the authors of uh, the article, the Project of the New American Century put out, used. Homeland. What kind of weird term is that? No one that I ever knew or knew ever referred to the United States of America, our country, the country we grew up in, as the homeland. It had this very, very sinister suggestion. And of course, the reason why is that Hitler introduced this term in 1934 at the Nuremberg rally, as he was, stirring up his fanatical followers, the homeland, the homeland. And of course, now we have homeland security. And it's such a powerful term because they linked homeland to security, home security. Your home is your castle. And now these bad people are trying to, get into your home, but we're not going to let them. we're going to create all these defensive forces, Homeland Security. So they establish it, and that a very, very powerful term, I think. Uh, that would be the second one that
Well,
I
I found that very interesting because you and I probably are pretty close to each other on when we were born. Uh, and never in my life have I ever heard uh, of the United States of America being referred to as the homeland or the motherland.
Right,
Never. I'm living in Russia now, and the Russians are very familiar with the term the motherland
right.
and defense of the motherland. Uh, you know, their DNA goes way back centuries. And so to hear this term homeland referring to the United States of America was like, whoo, where did that come from?
Yeah, exactly. And then the other term they use, it's another World War II term, or even goes further back, but it's no, it's World War II and post World War II. It's the term ground zero. So ground zero, uh, as people know, is this place where the a nuclear bomb has dropped, right? Uh, and by the way, coincidentally, if or not, the Pentagon had a cafe called the Ground Zero Cafe in the Pentagon, the Ground Zero Cafe. Uh, but it refers to nuclear weapons. And that
Well,
morning,
but Ed, uh, it referred to the first test explosion of a nuclear weapon in New Mexico. It was called
that's right.
Ground Zero.
Yes, of course, of course. And so on the morning of September 11th, a Fox News reporter, I think his name was Rick Leventhal, interviewed a guy on the street. His name was Mark Walsh, and he had a motorcycle T-shirt on. He was known as I forget the guy. So this guy Mark Walsh, he says to the reporter from Fox News. He says, well, obviously, he refers to what happened just, downtown a little bit as ground zero. And he says, obviously, the buildings fell because of a structural fire, because the flames just melted the steel and the buildings fell. Well, that was actually almost word for word the government's explanation for why the Twin Towers fell. And he referred to it as ground zero. And it's complete, utter nonsense. We know from all the studies on the melting of steel and the temperature and so forth. It's like saying the the fuel on the planes was so hot it could melt steel. Uh, uh, but that structural steel on these buildings, well, how come the fuel in the planes didn't melt the planes, the steel in the planes? Go ask some airline mechanics and others. But in any case, this guy Mark Walsh, he planted the seeds, and then the media kept on referring to ground zero. We have a new Pearl Harbor. We have ground zero downtown, uh, where the buildings collapsed. And then, of course, building 7 collapsed at 5:20 that afternoon, and no plane even hit. No plane hit building number 7. Uh, and it was obviously brought down by controlled demolition, just like the towers were. And in the preceding months before September 11th, those towers had their elevator shafts reworked on, and a perfect opportunity for the planting of controlled demolition in those buildings. But there's so much evidence that it wasn't the planes that brought down the buildings, but it was explosions. The man I mentioned, Graham McQueen, he interviewed and he wrote extensively on New York firefighters. They said the buildings went out like this, boom, 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 boom. All this evidence is there for anyone to look at. There's audio tapes. There's interviews with the firefighters, the cops, and all these people. And in fact, early TV reports across the TV reporters who were on the scenes said the same thing. But then the TV stations had to quickly cover that up. But early TV reporters were, it sounds like controlled demolition, controlled demolition, controlled. It sounds like bombs were going off in the buildings, which of course they were. They were. But it was forever known as Ground Zero then. And
Well, let me jump in. Forever known as Ground Zero. I visited Ground Zero in New York City. It's a memorial, a very beautiful place, very strange. It's a huge, like, waiting pool or uh,
right.
right, but it's called Ground Zero.
Yes.
We were in New York City and we said, we have to go to Ground Zero. I had to see what that was about. And so this was maybe like 5 or 6, no, 6 or 7 years ago when we went there. But the term has continued to this day, referring to where the Twin Towers felt. Um,
And
and
and if I could just say this, Regis, not only that term, but the term 9/11 is used by everyone, including all the critics of the government and their story about the events of, quote, 9/11. No one seems to get it, that this term is so evocative of the national emergency that's still in effect 24 years later, that is renewed every year by every president, Democrat, Republican. It doesn't make a difference. They all renew it, and we're in a national emergency. Wow.
well, we're connecting these terms that have conditioned and preconditioned Americans to accept the narrative. There's another one that you mentioned earlier, but now we're examining each of them independently. You started with Pearl Harbor, Homeland Security, Ground Zero. We finished talking about now. The last term, the unthinkable. Connect the
Yeah.
dots.
Well, the unthinkable is again the term examined very, very closely by Graham McQueen, the Canadian researcher in that book, the 2001 Anthrax Deception. In that is the term that the media kept using throughout October, but it's also the term that Bush used on May 1st of that year. We have to rethink the unthinkable. The unthinkable. So, what's the unthinkable that we have to rethink? We have to cancel the ABM treaty, which started all of those cancellations of all the treaties with Russia uh, that have brought us to the point where we're at today. Intermediate nuclear missile treaty and blah, blah, blah. I won't go through the list. Uh, so that was the word that was in these letters. And by the way, the two senators who received the anthrax letters, Leary and Daschle from North Dakota, uh, those were the two U.S. Senators, both Democrats, who were objecting, or at least temporarily objecting, to the signing on of the Patriot Act. Those are the two. Once they got their anthrax letters they signed on. So it was they obviously were being threatened, right? And the Patriot Act, which we haven't even mentioned yet, was prepared years in advance, years in advance. When I taught a college course on this subject in 2004, one of my students, we read every book, including the 9/11 Commission report, which is basically it's fiction. You know, it's a ridiculous piece of work, but it was presented like uh, the what is it, the one on Kennedy, uh, the government report on the killing of Kennedy.
Warren Commission.
The Warren Commission, these are like fictitious reports. Uh, and uh, so the Patriot Act, in fact, don't quote me, but I think I'm quite right on this, was pushed in about 1995 or six, the core of it by Senator Joseph Biden. So this stuff goes way back. The national emergency, the Patriot Act, which took away so many of the rights of American citizens and made everyone, into a terrorist who could be arrested or deported, as they are now, under Trump, or they were under the other presidents too. But this outrageous stuff that they're using. So it
Oh,
goes back a long time. But I had a student
let,
who brought the Patriot Act into school, in, and he placed it on. We sat in a rectangular big room, 26 students, and he placed it, and it was about 2 feet high. None of these senators ever who signed on, no one read it. No one read it. And to this day, probably no one has read it. But this boy, who was from France, actually, great kid, um, he went through it, and I subsequently went through it. Um, but it took away so many of the rights of American citizens. But they
yeah,
had
but
Homeland Security.
yeah, it didn't stop there. Then came the Homeland Security Act, uh, in
Right.
which anybody who uh, presented a counter argument to the official government narrative was a domestic terrorist. And then, Ed, if that wasn't enough, they passed legislation called the Domestic Terrorist Act, which
Yeah.
further defined people like you and me as challenging the government and are to be considered domestic terrorists, to be scooped up, whisked away without legal consultation, without formal charges, and just disappeared. It's happened to so many whistleblowers under Obama who uh, exposed so many of them. There's been political assassinations for people who expose government crimes. And now it's very dangerous in this country uh, to even speak and expose the kind of things we're talking about today. So let's continue. We've examined the language, the terms, and you wrote 9/11, 9/11, and 9/11 have been linked to endless wars on terror. And from there, you went on to explain the official explanations for these events by themselves do not stand up to elementary logic and are patently false. Pick it up from there, Ed. I mean, we've been
Sure.
lied to over and over again. And I think the story of 9/11 is not even the most recent attempt of the government to lie to us, but pick it up from there.
Sure. What I meant was, aside from the linguistic mind control, the events themselves have been studied assiduously by so many scientists, uh, um, airline pilots, engineers, researchers of all sorts. One, David Ray Griffin, a theologian, wrote about 14 books on the subject. His first being The New Pearl Harbor. That's the title of it. Extraordinary series of books. Uh, but many people have researched it. And when you think about the events of that day, how could the U.S. government has never given any evidence for their claim that 19 Arab hijackers, under the orders of Osama bin Laden, hijacked four planes, flew two into the World Trade Towers, one into the Pentagon, and one crashed in Pennsylvania. They've given no evidence. They just said Osama bin Laden, he was behind it. We don't have the list of these terrorists getting on the planes. We have maybe one or two very, very minor videos of these guys supposedly, going through airport security. We have no evidence. But how could these guys who couldn't even fly planes really they would fly these planes into the Twin Towers? I'm not saying the planes didn't hit the towers. I believe the planes hit the towers. But I think it's it should be very obvious to people that those planes were being controlled from the ground, not from the air. And that was very, very possible in those days. There are so many anomalies and ridiculous aspects to this whole story. Take cell phones. All these cell phone calls from these planes, I researched that really quite deeply, and I went and traveling around in the early 2000s. I did a lot of travel. I asked airline pilots, well, could you make a cell phone call from 30,000 feet? Oh, absolutely not. There was not one airline pilot, and I probably spoke to about a dozen who said, no, no, you couldn't. But we have all these so-called cell phone. I mean, there are so many aspects to it that don't make sense. Uh, Bringing down the towers with the planes, uh, building seven. It goes on and on. It really, the plane, you mentioned earlier, Cheney's down in the operation room, and Secretary of Transportation, Norman Mineta, is in the administration. He overhears him saying to a young officer who came in, do the orders still stand? And Cheney snaps at the guy and says, "Of course they still stand." There was a plane, the plane that was headed to the Pentagon, and the plan was it to shoot it down or to let it hit the Pentagon, and without getting into a debate about the whole Pentagon. But we know where it hit on the Pentagon. Whatever hit the Pentagon, hit it where Rumsfeld was not. And then, it hit it where it was under construction, and it killed innocent people who, and then the plane that crashes in Pennsylvania, was that plane shot down by U.S. jet fighters who were tailing it? The debris went over 2, 3, 4, 8 miles. How could a plane that hit in one spot in Pennsylvania, like all the debris bounced up and went like 2, 3, 4, 7 miles away? It's absurd. It doesn't make any sense. And the hole in the ground in Pennsylvania, there was nothing there. I mean, it goes on, but the story, you know, it's still there. People are fighting it. There's a big conference in Washington, D.C. today where many people, including a woman that I know, a friend of mine, Elizabeth Murray, who worked for the CIA, is talking, and former U.S. representative from Ohio, I forget his name now. All these people are talking because the story is ridiculous.
Well, Ed, what we're really talking about is linguistics. Words have the power to enchant and mesmerize, you wrote. Linguistic mind control. You wrote language as sorcery, especially when linked to traumatic events. Let's finish up with that, Ed. Your final conclusive thoughts.
Sure, I think the language that creates the narratives that are told about these events, that language is very carefully crafted by propagandists. And it's right there in George Orwell's 1984. Uh, you have to use the right language in order to get people to believe what you want them to believe. And anyone who studies propaganda, you mentioned Edward Bernays. There's a whole host. Hitler's people made it very, very clear that language was so important to affect people's thinking. So it's not just the videos. I mean, that's video and pictures are very, very important too. But language is the lone assassins that we hear about down through history, the crazy lone assassins, uh, Oswald, go through the list. There's so many. And if you keep saying they're crazy and they're lone wolves and they're lone assassins, that sticks in people's minds. Or the term conspiracy theorist. That's a CIA term that they used to discredit critics of the Warren Commission. That it's in a document. I mean, they they know that the words are important. Call someone a conspiracy theorist, and then their friends and others will say, "Well, you're kind of a nutcase. You may be a nice person, but you're nuts." Um, and that's it. So the use of language, very, very important.
Yeah, and I want to. I'm not in a hurry to finish this, Ed, uh, but I want to bring us up to date. I'll give two examples.
Good.
Uh, Israel has a right to defend itself, to justify the genocide in Palestine. They never talk about that. They just say, "Oh, Israel has a right to defend itself. It's been under attack, by all these real big bad Arabs." And the other example hits very close to home for me. Um, if you mention Russia, you mention Ukraine, or you mention Vladimir Putin, you have everything that the United States has projected on every enemy they've ever had. You can go back just to Hitler, what they projected on him, what they projected on Saddam Hussein, what they projected on Assad, what they projected on Gaddafi. It's the same methodology of using language to control people's minds and actions. I have lost so many friends because of the work that I've done over the last 10 or 12 years and the work that I've done here in Russia. Um, those words, Russia, Putin, war criminal, invaded, uh, uh, invaded Crimea, not only Ukraine, but Crimea, and brought it back into the Russian Federation. Ed, this is how strong it is. You cannot even get people to enter into a discussion, a logical discussion with facts. This is how bad it's gotten, Ed. It's not going to go away. Your final
No.
thought, Ed,
Well, I agree.
is there any way to get over it?
Well, maybe if I don't know. Uh, it's so much part of the propaganda network. I think people have to understand how propaganda works. Uh, I remember a number of years ago, this is uh, before the Russian and the war in Ukraine started, after the 2014 U.S. coup in Ukraine. Um, uh, a relative of mine went like berserk with me, calling Putin, a new Hitler, a devil, a totalitarian, and every name in the book. And I said, well, he's saying things about this coup and Russia's need to defend its borders as NATO encroaches right up to the borders that are true. So why are you calling him all these names? What's your evidence? Just give me some evidence. That's all I ask. And of course, there is no evidence. It's all emotional. He was mind controlled. And the Russian leadership, they talk like sensible people. Um, uh, Lavrov, Putin, they talk rationally. They make points, and then they get called names. The U.S. leadership talks gibberish. They talk gibberish. Trump talks gibberish. He talks like, he's on the street somewhere in front of his golden statue of himself in Manhattan. Uh, but yeah, the name calling is just incredible. I agree. And the example you gave of the Israelis, they have a right to defend themselves, but the Palestinians don't, right? They don't. But that's been, the U.S. has been behind that for 100 years. That's the ongoing tragedy beyond tragedies, genocide.
Yeah, Ed, I can't thank you enough for coming on the show with very short notice. I can't thank you enough for that incredible article you wrote. I'm going to put the link to your WordPress web page so people can find you and they can find all of your articles, which are so well researched, so profound, and so hard hitting. Thanks so much, Ed. Look forward to doing it again.
And if you would, Regis, mention my latest book, At the Lost and Found,
Absolutely.
because it's getting lost.
All right, my friend. We'll see
All
you
right.
again. Take care.
Thank you very much. Bye.